are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your hosts, Eugene Puryear, here as always, alongside my intrepid co-host, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, great to be back alongside you.
It is always a pleasure to be alongside you, Eugene, on this wonderful Thursday.
Indeed, the eve of July 4th, nonetheless,
hmm
upcoming holiday. So as always with holidays, I'm in a slightly different location. So don't worry, we haven't abandoned our studio. Uh, Thankful to be here with all of you, our viewers. Got a great show as always. I will remind you to go ahead and if you're watching on YouTube, hit subscribe, then hit the bell so you get the alerts for the things you subscribe to. I don't really know anything about YouTube, so I'm not even sure how any of this works. But all I know is you need to go to the drop-down menu under subscribe and select that you want all notifications on as well, apparently. YouTube has told us that not enough of you have all notifications turned on. So just turn on everything that involves notifications, hit anything that has anything to do with subscribing, hit any bells or alarms or whatever else is on there in order to make sure that you get very prompt notice about all of the fantastic content we have coming out from Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. So you want to make sure you're getting everything. And of course, if you're watching us on Free Speech TV, no need to do anything other than what you're already doing. Just keep watching, and big shout out to the FSTV team, as always, for making it possible for us to appear on that platform as well. Rania, are there other things you would like to say, or maybe even help explain, since I think you know more than I do about YouTube?
Okay, well, actually, not when it comes to the notifications. I just know that you need to hit the bell, and then there might be a thing that you have to do after that to make sure that you get notifications. We have to basically we gotta research this thing. We gotta research this and come back to you with better instructions. But Eugene, I do know that people can help support our show by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news and becoming a member for as little as $5 a month, where they can access exclusive content as well as exclusive merch like this very cool Breakthrough News mug. But most importantly, they can help support independent media like Breakthrough News. And there's another independent media outlet I want to shout out that we love here at Breakthrough News, and that's People's Dispatch. And oh my God, what is that? That's Zoe Alexandra, the managing editor of People's Dispatch here in Beirut, Lebanon. Hi, Zoe. Hello. Zoe's here in Lebanon with me right now, and so she had to come say hi. She's also a perk of joining Breakthrough
I appreciate
News.
that. You should have mic'd her up.
We should have mic'd her up. See you later, Zoe. You didn't see that one coming, did you, Eugene?
To be honest with you, I did, but that's all right.
You did?
As soon as you mentioned People's Dispatch, you kind of tipped your hand a little bit there.
I gave it out. Yeah, I gave it away.
I have inside knowledge of this game. I had context clues there.
But yeah, we love People's Dispatch. We love having Zoe here with us in Lebanon. Lots actually happened in Lebanon today. The Israelis widened their strikes in Lebanon today. And that is what we give you here at Breakthrough News. We give you people on the ground all over the world, including me here in Lebanon, and also coming to you from an independent leftist lens that does not want to drag you into war so that Lockheed Martin can pad their pockets more than they already have. So seriously, patreon.com/breakthrough news. We've got a great show for you today, and I will throw it back to you, Eugene. Do you have any special guests to introduce in the background before we go any further?
Sadly, I'm here alone. That sounds way worse. But nonetheless, let's just move on with the show. Good segue you made there, talking about imperial war and plunder linked to the United States, because we want to first turn to the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the United States is certainly doing its best to engage in even more imperial plunder. And we are very, very happy to be joined here on the show once again by Kambale Musavuli, who is an analyst with the Center for Research on the Congo, Kinshasa. As always, Kambale, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you for keeping the story over and over of the Congo. And history will remember that. I'm pretty sure of it.
Well, certainly it's the least we can do. And I want to start with this so-called peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda, brokered by the United States, much touted by the United States, sort of alongside this. I think it's still maybe not 100% agreed to, but correct me if I'm wrong, there a potential mineral and military deal between the U.S. and DRC, which is also sort of a part of this process. I mean, I guess my first question for you is this, is how durable is this deal from the point of view of peace? Because the State Department text, I mean, it sounds like many of the deals that have already failed. And it seems like it's a little bit more about the United States getting its foot in the door economically in the eastern part of the DRC, but perhaps I'm being too cynical there.
We are commemorating Patrice Lumumba's 100th anniversary. It was just yesterday, pretty much July 2nd. And that deal has to be read from Lumumba's writings, Lumumba's speeches, and so on. And the reason I'm saying this is one of the most famous quotes from Patrice Lumumba, that Africa's history is not going to be written in Washington, it's not going to be written in Paris, Brussels, or the UN. It's going to be written by Africans from north to south, a history of dignity and glory, right? The United States has no capacity, historically, to broker a peace deal. We know that. I want to see where the US actually facilitated peace around the world. We can't even look at what is happening right now. The genocide in Palestine, the wars over in Asia, be it East Asia, not the entire continent of Asia, where the US has been engaged militarily for decades. And on the African continents, the different coups that the US has backed. So it does not have a track record of bringing about peace and stability anywhere around the world. I mean, if someone has cancer, do you go see a pediatrician for that? Right? You have to have someone who has the experience. So that's the reality. That's the number one reality of that deal. The second, that deal is rewriting Congo's history. Is presenting the conflict as a conflict between Rwanda and Congo, right? Not really a war of aggression where Congo's territorial integrity is affected, where millions of Congolese have died. There is not even a mention of the death toll in the Congo in that deal. That will have signaled that this is a deal for peace, because we know that peace can only happen if it is tied to justice, right? And justice can only also unfold when people are telling the truth, and the truth has not been told. And lastly, the part of the deal that we do not see is the commercial deal, and they intentionally are keeping it hidden. But luckily, there were leaks before the signing of the diplomatic deal between Rwanda and DRC, where it stipulated that the Congolese government is putting forward $3 trillion worth of Congo's minerals in exchange of the US engagement to broker this peace deal and provide military support and military training. That's according to African intelligence article a couple of months ago. So $3 trillion of mineral wealth is equivalent to about one-tenth of Congo's wealth. Congo's wealth is estimated at $24 trillion, right? And there is no country in the world outside of the United States that has access to about one-tenth of Congo's minerals. And I'm pointing that out because it's important, right? And the reason why it's important is because around 2008, when China had a $9 billion deal, not even a trillion, right? $9 billion deal, we were told China is colonizing the Congo. China is exploiting the Congolese. There was no discussion about China is helping infrastructure that will bring about peace and stability. None of that, right? But the US has hundreds times more access to the minerals, right? The $3 trillion deals. No media has yet said that this peace deal being brokered is a way of the US recognizing the Congo. Not even discuss that this is actually what is happening, $3 trillion wealth, and forgetting that we are where we are today because also of US foreign policy. That the conflict in the Congo, which started in 1996, is a direct result of two of US allies, Rwanda and Uganda, who have invaded the Congo twice in 96 and 98. They continue to support proxy rebel militias, while the United States, European Union are continuously providing them with military equipment to cause the chaos. So we in the Congo, be it in communities around, be it those who are challenging the government, they all are saying the same thing, that this deal does not represent the Congolese people. the way to know that if you represent the Congolese people is if there is a question of justice, and the fact that there is no question of justice in this deal is only to support American corporations who are going to benefit to get access to Congo's minerals needed in the fourth industrial revolution.
I'm curious, Kambale, if you could elaborate on that a bit, because of course, Washington's presenting this deal as some sort of peace triumph. We all know that Trump likes to take credit for making deals, probably thinks he's going to get like the Nobel Peace Prize or something. But as you've said, this has a lot more to do with locking down access to Congo's vast mineral wealth. So could you talk a bit about the way this is actually cover for corporate looting? That, by the way, already takes place, but this would just, I guess, expand that or make it easier.
Yeah. I mean, and it's also very important to connect what's happening in the Congo and what's happening in the US right now. Because people would think that this so-called big blue, what do they call it? Big
beautiful bill.
Right? Has nothing to do with what's happening around the world, right? We know that this bill is going to make billionaires in the United States have access to capital, right? They're giving them money. And we know where they're going to use their money, right? They're going to use it on the African continent to get access to minerals. Don't think that I'm just throwing that as a general statement. Where was Bill Gates in May? Wasn't he in the DRC, right? No, Bill Gates flew into the DRC, signed a deal to get access to a mine in Manono, in the Kolwezi area. And that lithium mine, the deal is for $1 billion, right? Bill Gates, billionaire, flew into the Congo to get a mine, a lithium mine for $1 billion, right? He owns a company called, him and Jeff Bezos, actually, they own a company called Cobalt Metals, right? And Cobalt, their expertise is to use artificial intelligence to find critical minerals, right? So it's all coming back full circle. Then they're going to have a big tax cut for their operations there. So they are moving money from the oppressed in the United States, where you're losing your Medicaid, you're losing so many benefits. That wealth is moving also on the African continent, right? Allowing these billionaires and corporations to buy mines a penny on the dollar, because at the moment, the US is unable to compete in innovation, right? They're not able to produce the best AI models in the world. They can't compete with advancing technology, but what they can compete on is figuring out a way to counter China on the African continent, where they will control the critical minerals, and Congo holds most of the critical minerals on the African continent. It's the #1 producer of cobalt. He has one of the largest lithium reserve in the world. And unfortunately, the elites of the Congo, the president of the Congo and his government, have put on a silver platter the access to Congo's minerals, which is in contradiction with the will of the Congolese people.
One of the things that jumped out at me in the State Department release was, was talking about the need to respect, quote unquote, the negotiations between the DRC and M23 in the context of the Doha talks that they're having. And I thought it was interesting when you put it with former President Joseph Kabila sort of reemerging in the East, that in a way, even though it's being presented as sort of like a quote unquote deal between Rwanda and DRC, it seems like that element in and of itself is really that part of the deal, or what the United States would like to see, is a further entrenchment of, Rwandese power, if you will, into the state of Congo.
I mean, as we're speaking right now, the UN group of experts is due to publish a report, their final report that they amended it to publish. And it's already stated, I mean, the report has been leaked. I'll make sure to send you a copy of it so you could see. It may be published very soon, but it's now in the open. That in that report, even though Rwanda has signed the agreement, right now in the report is saying in plain words that Rwanda's objective in the Congo is to actually annex the eastern part of Congo. And this is something the Congolese have said. And the reason why Rwanda wants to annex the eastern part of Congo is because it's a land rich of minerals. So no matter where they will go for this, be it in Doha, be it in Nairobi, be it in Rwanda, in the end, if we don't hold the perpetrator of violence accountable, mineral wealth will continue to come out of the Congo and millions of deaths will continue. But what's important to remember about this deal, when even you read it, and I'm kind of mentioning it quickly in saying that it's rewriting Congo's history, but there are some basic element also that is helpful in terms of thinking about what's happening. The fact that Rwanda is signing an agreement for peace in the Congo, then we know that the M23 is really a proxy, right? The Congo is not signing a peace agreement with M23 in Washington, D.C. They're signing it with a foreign government. So, which means that Rwanda is actually an aggressor country and they are coming into negotiating. That's one level. The second level is the fact that the US is organizing this peace deal. It means that they recognize that since 1996, there has been a conflict that has killed people and something should happen with it. And I'm pointing that out because there is actually a US law that the US should implement, right? A US law, Public Law 109456, that is the Democratic Republic of Congo Relief, Security, Democracy Promotion Act, mouthful, written by Barack Obama, signed into law by George Bush, always, never implemented fully. Why? Because Section 105 of that law says that the Secretary of State, today, which is Rubio, has the power to withhold aid to nations destabilizing the Congo. So the US is recognizing that, right, by organizing this deal and the signing of the deal. But how come when you have evidence of your own ally causing chaos, you're unwilling to hold them accountable? And we've seen that. And that's why in the beginning, I kind of started speaking about what's happening in Palestine. So it's important for people around the world to recognize the contradiction that's happening now, right? The contradiction where international law is not followed. Some countries are treated differently than others. So the sanction regime it depends on how the US president wakes up, who is his friend that day, who's not. While we, the working people of the world, be it in Los Angeles, when ICE is coming around using AI, be it from Palantir or other companies, exploiting us. And as in the Congo, we are really right at the bottom of the supply chain, seeing the raw materials, seeing how our minerals is being given to American corporation and penny on the dollar, that the people on both sides of the Atlantic must unite because we know who the enemy is. And the enemy will always be capitalism, will always be imperialism. And we have to unite to stop these forces from exploiting us and causing chaos around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot to continue to follow and see here as the Rwandan and Congolese sides continue their discussions and the U.S. sits over top of all of it. And as always, we are honored to have you, Kambale Musavuli, joining us to help us sort through it all.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Oh, Eugene, it just feels like the imperialist side is really digging their heels in and going all in everywhere all at once. Just
yeah.
Never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity.
Well, in Congo is one of the most important opportunities, as you can see it, and sort of amazing that President Tshisekedi is just going to sell his country here. But anyway, another story for another time. We'll have to continue to discuss that. I said Rwandese a little bit earlier there. I meant Rwandan, and I just have to say that because I know somebody's going to say something in the comments later. So I'm correcting myself for anyone who wants to correct me. But we'll keep covering the Congo. We'll keep following it. We'll keep bringing on a number of different people, as we always have, of Congolese heritage to discuss many of these issues. But Kambale mentioned it, the one big beautiful bill, as it's been dubbed by the Trump administration and the Republican leadership in both houses of Congress, is moving down the pike, as it were. And one, of course, major element of that is a massive set of tax cuts that certainly seem to favor one set of people over others, although I know the White House is trying to contest that. So to get to the bottom of what's really happening here, Rania, we are very, very honored to be joined by Amy Hanauer, who is the Executive Director of the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, ITEP. Amy, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you, and thanks also to the whole ITEP team for putting out fantastic analysis on this. And I, having read it, have a little bit of a sense of what's happening. But for our viewers who maybe haven't, the White House is saying that this is a bill that will have tax cuts that mainly benefit working and middle class Americans. And so I'd just like to ask you, are they telling the truth?
That is an absolute lie. This bill actually delivers over the next decade $1 trillion to the top 1% of taxpayers in America. $1 trillion, and those are brand new numbers based on this bill. 70% of the benefits go to the top 20%, the wealthiest 20% of earners. This is not equitable. It takes money from programs that help low and middle income people and shifts it to the wealthy.
It's so insane. It's so insane that that's a massive transfer of wealth. And on top of that, this bill slashes food aid, healthcare, all kinds of social supports at a time when millions across the US are already struggling. So I'm curious if you can talk about the specific programs that are going to take a hit here and what the real life consequences of those cuts might look like.
Yeah, thanks so much for asking about that. I mean, this really is a sort of shift in our history. It is a historic change in the way we want to approach our people. So these are the biggest cuts to food aid in history in the United States, and really kind of reneging on a long-term promise, like a commitment that the federal government made, that while food aid has always been very, 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 very modest, that we would make sure that the very hungriest children and people with disabilities and elderly people in our country would at least get a minimal amount of food. But this bill reneges on that promise. It's also the biggest cuts in history to healthcare coverage, and that will affect both lower income families who are on Medicaid, but it will also affect families who have been getting Affordable Care Act subsidies.
Amy, one of the things that ITEP also does fairly frequently that I think is notable is you put out a report on corporations that basically pay no taxes because they're able to sort of, do all these different pieces. So we know that the tax cuts for the wealthiest people and corporations are so big, but we know there's also big cuts to the IRS as well. So, I mean, is it possible that the tax cuts could even be bigger than we expect for the wealthy because it will be easier for them to exploit loopholes?
Well, there's always that possibility. There are always ways that these things play out a little bit differently than what we expect. I think at the scale that we're talking about, though, the story is just really, really clear. And what you're saying about the IRS is valid. Like, the IRS has been really, just stripped of its power to enforce the tax code on the wealthiest people and corporations. And what that means is that they then tend to turn their energy to low-income families who collect the earned income tax credit, leaving all of this money on the table from these wealthy tax cheats. So it's really a kind of crazy way of doing things.
Amy, I think every few years, especially when there's Republicans in charge, but it can even happen when there's Democrats in charge sometimes, you'll have these bills that end up giving more tax cuts to the wealthy, to the point where some people might hear that and think, oh yeah, this is just like another version of what we see when these people are in charge, is more tax cuts for the wealthy. So I'm just curious if you can talk a bit about how this bill is different from perhaps past bills where we've seen these massive tax cuts for the rich. Because yes, this sort of, is an evolution of that, but this kind of goes to more extreme degrees.
That's right. I mean, this is actually the biggest upward redistribution of wealth in our nation's history because it so aggressively cuts programs that serve low and middle income families, primarily low income families, really. And it so aggressively shifts resources to the wealthiest people and corporations. And that's kind of historic. And I'll just say the three major things that this bill really, really weakens is it weakens the progressive income tax. That's a very progressive tax because the more you earn, the more you pay. It weakens the corporate income tax, and we can get into that a little bit more in follow-up questions if you want, but that is a very progressive tax that falls heavily on the wealthiest people and also happens to fall on foreign investors. So they'll both be getting a break in this. And it weakens the estate tax, which is the stopgap we have against intergenerational transfer of wealth from dynastic wealthy families to their heirs. Those families can now hand down $30 million before anyone pays a penny of estate tax. So this is just going to perpetuate a really extreme income divides, racial wealth divides in this country.
Wow, that's the state tax. That's quite something. I do want to talk more about the corporate income tax because obviously I think corporations have had, a pretty good run of years. And I think all of us who've been suffering from inflation have certainly been, feeling that. We've been paying a lot more, and you see the share buybacks, you see, billionaires gaining more and more money. So talk about that if you could, because I think, obviously big corporations are what a lot of people think about when they think about who should be paying larger shares of their profits towards our shared needs.
Yeah, I mean, so my organization, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, and anyone who's listening can find our stuff at itep.org, itep.org. We monitor this. And so we found in 2022, I think it was, that 55 highly profitable corporations paid zero in corporate income taxes that year. And we found that after the first Trump tax law, the 2017 tax law, that there just was a really dramatic decline in the share of their income that corporations were paying in taxes. So well below the corporate rate. I mean, I believe the average share that corporations are paying was in the 12% range. That's on a rate that's 21%. So you just see this ability to really avoid responsibility. And the irony is that it's the infrastructure that we've put in place that, of course, has enabled these corporations to build their wealth in the first place. I mean, it's because we have good roads and good infrastructure to get products out to market. It's because we have a solid banking system that's regulated that people feel safe spending. And but despite that, we want to balance the budget on people who qualify for Medicaid, which is very, very low income families.
So I want to ask you about what the pushback has been. Are Democrats pushing back, or did they push back? Because now this bill has made it through Congress. Did they push back in any meaningful way, or was there some bipartisan complicity here?
I mean, in fairness to the Democrats, not one Democrat voted for this bill. And I think that there were some really lively exchanges where a number of members of the Senate and the House really tried to draw attention to just how devastating this piece of legislation is going to be to our economy and to low and middle income families. So I believe they introduced more amendments than has ever been introduced before. And they introduced amendments that really highlight the estate tax cuts, the corporate tax cuts, the income tax cuts, the Medicaid cuts. They tried to introduce amendments that would protect people on Medicaid. So I think that there was pretty good unity in that regard. Now, whether or not Democrats are doing a good job of communicating to voters, I think that's another story entirely. I think a lot of voters don't understand what just happened. This bill is extraordinarily unpopular when people learn the details, but a lot of people, it's just flying under the radar.
No, I think that's very true. And there's been so much obfuscation. I mean, that White House press conference with, workers coming up there, making it seem like that. So a lot of confusion. And it makes me wonder about another issue too regarding this is, I think the vast majority of people were all worried about, the cost of everything seems to be going up, more or less month to month, but everything's getting more expensive. And the tariffs, we don't know exactly how that's going to land, but that feels like that could have a big impact because even if I do get, a bigger tax refund, it feels like a lot of it could just be, wiped away.
No, 100%. And we did analysis of this for the first time and just found that for 80% of the population of the United States, the increase in costs from tariffs is going to either make it so that the tax cuts make you break even, or it's even going to result in a loss. So that's before you even get to the Medicaid cuts and the healthcare cuts. The tariffs alone sort of wipe out most of the tax savings for low and middle income families. I think we're going to see really big price spikes for American families for a lot of things that we've counted on getting. And, there's a role for tariffs when they're accompanied by a sort of smart industrial strategy, but this ain't it.
Speaking to that, I want to ask you about the long-term consequences here, because I think with these kinds of things, and I know this is like really unprecedented, like you described it as the biggest wealth transfer in history, it's easy to kind of see it in the moment, be like, oh no, this is horrible, and move on. But what are, the long-term impacts we're going to see from this on inequality, on that sort of racial and intergenerational inequality, and I guess moving forward, what does that mean for the country?
Yeah. It's funny that you asked that. I recently had a loss in my family, and it got me thinking about how somebody born in 1934, what kind of arc of life they were able to have. And of course, the biggest problem in the United States has always been that we didn't deliver those opportunities in an equitable way. But for many people living in the 20th century, that's when we established the estate tax. It's when we established the income tax. It's when we established the corporate tax. And it's when we established Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and food aid to families. A lot of these were outgrowths of the Great Depression. Well, are we providing those same kinds of opportunities for a kid born today? I really hate to say it, but I just don't think that we are. And so instead of moving in the direction of saying, hey, we provided this opportunity for some, let's make sure we provide it for everyone, I think what Republicans did this week was the exact opposite, which is to say, hey, we're providing this to some, let's just restrict who gets that kind of opportunity even further. So it's a daunting moment for somebody who cares about this country.
No, I think that's for sure. It doesn't feel like a beautiful bill, at least to me, in this context. Amy, you mentioned it at a little bit earlier, but I just want you to mention it again, where folks can find your work, because you all are doing fantastic stuff, and not just at the federal level, also examining at the state level everything that's happening with taxes.
Yeah, you can find any of the things that I've talked about today at itep.org. That's where you can find that we're giving $1 trillion to the top 1%. That the tariffs exceed the savings for a lot of taxpayers, and that this is just a heavily skewed piece of legislation.
Amy Hanauer, thank you so much for joining us here on the Freedom Side today.
Wonderful to be here.
Rania?
I mean, Eugene, it's just freaking unbelievable, but also believable. And the idea of calling it the big, beautiful bill, what a great marketing ploy.
Yeah.
It's everything up is down, forward is backwards. That's the world we live in. Everything's a massive gaslight. And it's just horrifying that this passed. And
yeah.
I mean, it's like, how many more massive wealth transfers do you get to have before we just have gone back 100 years? Actually in the US, you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I really can't recommend ITEP any higher in terms of, the information they're putting out on a daily basis, which is, very, very useful. And I just want to say before we move on that I know about the Institute for Taxation and Economic Policy because of the late Dr. David Schwartzman, a very good friend of mine who unfortunately passed on Tuesday afternoon, former Howard University professor, climate scientist, longtime advocate for DC statehood, for socialism, for all forms of peace and justice. But many, 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 many years ago now, I feel pretty old saying this, when he and I were first starting to work together, he said, you have to look up the ITEP report on such and such and such and such taxation, such and such. And I was like, who is this and what are they doing? And I've been hooked since then, because they're really going deep at the federal and the state level on these issues and explaining the reality of this, which is being totally obscured. I mean, the other aspect of this is the Senate Republicans are using like a weird accounting trick I don't even know if you can call it a counting trick. It's almost just like sorcery that is saying that this won't add to the deficit, that in fact it will create a surplus because you can't assume. It's hard to even explain. It just look it up. If you want to look it up, it's like a crazy accounting trick so that it doesn't look like they're adding trillions of dollars to the deficit when they are, because of course this is something Republicans are very concerned about, and they're just creating a fake surplus. It's like a weird, just sort of magic wand type reality there, and it just shows how pernicious so much of this stuff really is, because it is just lies on top of lies on top of lies. And David Dayen, who's been on the show a number of times, I hope folks check out the American Prospect today, because he has an article about how there could be hundreds of billions of dollars in Medicare cuts. Now, we're already talking about the hundreds of billions of dollars in Medicaid cuts, but he was pointing out how some of the language in the bill means that there will be hundreds of millions of dollars in Medicare cuts. So remember, Trump says, I'm not going to kick anyone off Medicaid. Millions of people are going to get kicked off Medicaid. Not going to cut Medicare. Obviously, they're cutting Medicare. Not going to cut Social Security. Yet to be seen, but it certainly seems like that could happen as well. And then the final thing I just want to say about this, Rania, too, is the one big beautiful bill is not even all the cuts. This is just what they could get into the omnibus bill, but they will actually start next week doing even more cutting of other elements of the fiscal year 2026 budget in order to cut things even more deeply. And that's how they got a lot of people to sign onto this who were complaining about the deficit, saying it didn't cut enough. They had Russ Vought come over there as director of OMB and say, don't worry, we're going to really cut stuff to the bone. And even more, the way they've set it up, a lot of the tax cuts will hit before the benefit cuts. So it'll create for a lot of people kind of a mirage where they may actually make it seem like they have a little bit more money in their pocket from the tax cuts that doesn't get fully wiped away in terms of everything else until a little bit later. And they're doing that so that you don't vote against the Republicans in the midterms. So the whole thing is just being done in the most ridiculous way possible. But, be that as it may, but did want to say that about Dr. David Schwartzman, who I know a lot of people
seems
in the
like now's
talking about.
Now's a really great time to have some sort of socialist movement in America. That's all I'm saying. I mean, I just don't even know what more provocation you could need than this.
Listen, Eugene Debs was telling us that in 1912. We should have listened then, and I'm not saying that because we have the same name. But let's move forward to the other. It's part of the big beautiful bill. It's part of everything that Trump has been doing, and that is just the all-out assault on immigrant communities in this country. And I am very, very happy that we are able to be joined here on the show by Jesse Franzblau, who is the Associate Director of Policy with the National Immigrant Justice Center. Jesse, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks so much, Eugene. Thanks so much, Rania. Really appreciate you having me on.
Great to have you. I'm going to look at my notes here because I saw something that just blew me away about the one big beautiful bill, and I want to actually get it correct and not just make this up, since people might accuse me of that. So this is according to Aaron Reichland Melnick. With this vote, Congress makes ICE the highest funded federal law enforcement agency in history, with more money per year at its disposal over the next 4 years than the budgets of the FBI, DEA, ATF, U.S. Marshals, and Bureau of Prisons combined. I mean, that is massive in terms of what is going on here. I almost don't even know how to characterize this, Jesse, but it really does feel like this is I always hate to say unprecedented, but I guess in my lifetime of being 39 years old, it feels unprecedented in terms of what is being done to immigrant communities.
It's a generational change. It really is. All the analysis that Aaron provides there. Aaron is a good friend and colleague. His analysis is always really spot on and never sensational. Those numbers are incredibly chilling. It's really important to remember that there's an entire separate process that funds ICE for the fiscal year. So we're talking about fiscal year appropriated numbers for the entire agency of ICE. That's gotten to about 10 billion. Which is an enormous amount of money. If we just ICE has only been here, of course, since 2003. It started out obviously quite small. It's just expanded enormously in terms of every year a little bit more funding. 10 billion for fiscally appropriated funds. This is at 45 billion just for ICE detention. then an extra 30 billion for ICE enforcement, an extra 2 billion for CBP enforcement, 59 billion for CBP for the border wall, 13 billion for this state border security reinforcement fund, and 10 billion for this basically slush fund for the Department of Homeland Security, unrestricted funds that they could use for additional border enforcement, no due process, and safeguards as a part of that, and 1 billion for the military, for the DoD, for border militarization that also includes detention of immigrant communities. So we're going to be seeing detention of people in military facilities or in places where the military is in charge. We're already seeing this start. There's an El Paso South-sided facility where we understand people are being detained, held using military funds. We're going to be seeing it's a complete game changer. It's a generational change that we're looking at in terms of the nature of this enforcement machine. I mean, I've seen even folks comparing the numbers to the global military spending. This puts ICE ahead of other countries' global military spending, ahead of many countries. I have to pull that up. I think it's a good figure to look at. But in terms of a U.S. interior enforcement body, it's really a game changer in terms of what ICE is going to be provided.
Oh, sounds like a really, really scary situation that we're looking at here. And on top of that, Jesse, I mean, this isn't just about funding, right? Because there's also legal power changes that are taking place in parallel. You have the Supreme Court having just handed Trump this unprecedented authority by essentially stripping lower courts of the power to block presidential actions. So I'm curious if you can talk a bit about that and what are the immediate legal implications of that ruling.
Yeah, this is all, there's so many facets to this assault on immigrant communities that has been happening really acutely since January 20th, but obviously far before that. But just to get into some of the recent ones, that Supreme Court decision that at its heart, or part of it goes after class action litigation. And so many organizations that sue when there are really awful policies that come down, for example, the family separation policy, ACLU, other organizations jump in to sue. My organization, the National Immigrant Justice Center, our litigation team sues on a number of issues related to detention issues. Actually just had a really positive decision related to this authority that the Trump administration has been using, this 212F authority for expulsions. Actually just had a really good decision in that case. But part of the recent Supreme Court decision is making it more difficult for these class action suits, so to stop a policy across the country, basically. So it makes it far more difficult to stop these policies as in real time, basically, as they are underway.
You know, Jesse, one aspect of this too is the way that the courts are being empowered, the way that, you know, ICE and these other forces are being empowered. I mean, it's obviously, you know, targeted at the immigrant community without even a shadow of a doubt. But, you know, I would consider that sort of immigrant community writ large. I mean, we've already seen the racial profiling in LA, but, you know, given the fact that immigrants are from, you know, so many different countries around the world, I mean, this feels like sort of a net of terror that can, you know, be sort of thrown over all sorts of people who ICE just perceives to be someone they want to go after. And now they're a little bit more empowered by the courts, it seems, to, you know, do these type of things and maybe avoid some level of accountability. So it just feels like overall, when we're talking about the militarization of society, and we've been talking for some time since Ferguson about the overall militarization of police, that this fits very much into that context.
Yeah, it really does. And also the mass incarceration component of it, which is, of course, something I know, Eugene, that you've covered so closely over the years. We're really looking at the growth of the mass incarceration industry, just completely expanding in terms of immigration detention. The same major private prison companies that have profited for years off of mass incarceration and have fueled mass incarceration, of course, along racial and ethnic lines, a very just racist and biased system, has completely expanded into the immigration detention space, to the point where we're actually seeing even physical prisons that had been closed down, that had been shuttered, just flipping over and becoming immigration detention prisons. We're seeing this in northern Michigan, this North Lake former Geo Group prison that's just now opened up as an immigration detention center, completely to the profit of the company Geo Group. We're seeing this also did happen under the Biden administration, the Moshannon Valley detention facility that opened up under the Biden administration. It's a complete windfall for these contractors. This is exactly where these billions of funds that are being cut and taken from communities for Medicaid and for SNAP. This is where these billions are going towards. These private prison companies that drive up and incentivize the detention and the targeting of immigrant communities. And as you say, it covers not only just immigrant communities, but empowering ICE, which carries out these enforcement practices in a completely racialized and abusive way, opens up these type of abuses to be carried out on anyone. And particularly the surveillance practices, because the type of surveillance practices the ICE also uses as part of the enforcement practices also are rolled out against on all type of communities. And we've of course seen the impact that it has on freedom of speech. We've seen the way that ICE has become a political police in terms of targeting students. And I think everyone, I'm sure a lot of people listening to your show have read the letter from Mahmoud Khalil when he was in an ICE detention facility, saying that this is about everybody that's left behind in these detention facilities. Nobody should be facing these type of abuses, and nobody should be facing this type of a system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Jesse, I mean, this is really insane because all of this infrastructure, this policing infrastructure that, as you mentioned, we've talked about a lot on this show, the way it's so easily able to be maneuvered to tackle an entirely different community, or just putting into place these mechanisms of militarized policing to shut down protests, shut down speech in all these different ways is quite frightening. And in another trend we're seeing is Donald Trump and the people around him saying that, they want to go after green card holders. In the case of Mahmoud Khalil, they have. And that they ultimately want to go after naturalized citizens and probably at some point citizens. You hear this term denaturalization being thrown out. You have it being threatened against Zohran Mamdani. And so I'm just curious if you can talk a bit about the concern about what's to come or what comes next when you have the president of the country who, has this deportation machine that he's putting on steroids and is also chipping away at legal protected rights of people to try to essentially take away their legal status and eventually take away their citizenship.
Yeah, it is quite chilling, of course, this speech. It just shows, I think, that this immigration enforcement machine, it really has no bounds in terms of, unless Congress stops this machine, unless they put serious brakes, serious checks on this machine, serious cuts to the funding, we're going to just see this continued lawless type of enforcement practices. And it's completely emboldened by these type of policy changes in terms of the way that this administration clearly wants to go after citizens. They want to go after. They're going after birthright, of course. They're going after. They're trying to denaturalize people. They're going after green card holders, as we've seen. And there's really no limits, and so it's really incumbent on Congress in a large part. Obviously, we've just seen Congress barely hand over this bill. I think it's really important to remember that the numbers were incredibly thin. It was completely on Republican lines, but they even lost 3 senators on the Republican side and 2 members of the Republicans on the House side. It's a deeply unpopular bill, not only because of the massive Medicaid cuts, but it's wildly unpopular, these policies, in terms of looking at even the polling, in terms of people are even, in red states, are completely up in arms around the just dramatic due process violations, constitutional violations. We've seen the uproar over Kilmar Abrego Garcia's case, which I think it's important also for folks to look at that case and read about his testimony of what he faced while in El Salvador's prison, Secot. But it is really boundless, and until Congress actually puts some bounds and reins in and puts under control this agency, it's going to continue to expand. And there are things Congress can still do: visiting detention facilities, demanding accountability. There are a lot of different measures that are really vital to do. Not only the rhetorical sweeping statements, but really getting on the ground and visiting facilities and taking action to push back against this really dramatic overreach and abuse of power.
No, well, it's it's quite the situation, and there's a lot for us to sort through. So we really appreciate you being willing to join us, Jesse. Jesse Franzblau, Associate Director of Policy with the National Immigrant Justice Center. Thank you so much for some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thanks so much, both, for all your work. Appreciate you.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I gotta say, this is all happening as the U.S. and empire escalate around the world. I mean, while they're escalating internally, just today in Lebanon, there was this Israeli drone strike on a vehicle in a very busy area near Beirut called Khaldi. As people were basically like leaving, this congested area to go south. And there's video footage of it. I watched it before we started recording, of that drone strike, and it's just insane. It's like in the middle of a high traffic hour. And this is at a time when like the Israelis and the Americans are putting all this pressure on Hezbollah in Lebanon to disarm, and they're trying to do it like across the country to disarm, and they're trying to do it by bombing them into submission, bombing Lebanon into submission. This is during a ceasefire, and I raised this to say that all of these escalations by empire that we're seeing inside and outside, it's happening everywhere. And I know the next story we're about to tackle is a part of that escalation, so I'm also trying to tee that up, but it really is just kind of insane right now everywhere.
Yeah, no, it really is. Well, thanks for handing off the baton. Our next story is really the cruelty is the point, is the phrase that comes to mind when I think about this one, and that is the tightening of the blockade against Cuba by the United States. We are very, very happy to be joined to discuss all of this by Manolo De Los Santos, who's the co-executive director of the People's Forum and a researcher at the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, two fantastic organizations. Manolo, thank you so much for being with us.
Despite the horrible circumstances, I'm honored to be back on the show with you, Rania and Eugene. Thank you for having me again.
Absolutely. Well, eventually we'll be bringing you on for something very triumphant. It'll happen. Don't worry.
Yes.
Maybe let's just start with the news itself, because this sort of flew under the radar, I think, unless you're someone who really follows Cuba, that Trump has announced this 30-day period to study how to tighten the blockade. What exactly did he propose, and is there any indication of what some of the potential things they could put into place could be?
Well, Trump's memo from this week regarding Cuba is essentially a re-editing of Trump's policy from his first administration against Cuba, which is when we saw 243 new sanctions placed against Cuba. It's when we saw Cuba being placed on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. It's when the US basically went against Cubans being able to send remittances to their families on the island. It was like the massive maximum pressure campaign initiated by Trump. And that, despite the promises to the contrary, Biden continued under his administration. Nothing changed during those 4 years, and have now essentially been giving new life with Trump, but also with Marco Rubio and a whole crew of far-right mafiosos from Florida who have essentially taken this opportunity to, I would say, not just tighten the noose on Cuba, but to essentially seek to crush not just the Cuban Revolution, but I would say the Cuban people at this stage.
Well, what's interesting here is that this seems to target Cuban companies that have quote unquote alleged ties to the country's military. I'm just curious what that in particular is about. And then also from there, Manolo, could you maybe give us an idea? These sanctions, obviously Cuba's been under blockade for decades and decades, but these sanctions in particular really tightened the noose around Cuba, made it harder for the country and its people to breathe, essentially. And it's been years now. So what have been the consequences since Biden put those sanctions into place?
Well, Rania, those are very important questions, and I would say that in particular, the the focus of this new memo and overall Trump's and Rubio's strategy over the last 6 months has been to particularly not just attack Cuba directly, but to intimidate its trading partners around the world. The US constantly says that the blockade doesn't affect Cuba's trade with the rest of the world, but in fact, it actually does on a daily basis. And it's trying to prevent, for example, Cuba's partners in the hotel industry, in the tourism industry, from investing in the renovation of Cuba's tourism industry. It will seek to prevent, for example, Cuba being able to buy fuel on the international market from other partners, even from partners that have strong ties to Cuba and have historically traded with Cuba. It will try to limit Cuba's ability, for example, to be able to renew its electrical grid at this moment when it's suffering major blackouts across the country. So it's, I would say, the maximum pressure campaign, in addition to over 60 years of blockade, which have left Cuba, with damages of over 164 billion US dollars, which the list only continues to grow every year. But the reality is that right now, as we speak, ordinary Cubans have to face blackouts, sometimes of upwards 20 hours a day, because of the lack of fuel, because of the lack of electricity. It's so hard to simply be able to just go to work or to run to school. Life, in a sense, has sort of been forced to grind to a halt in many senses, despite the Cubans resisting and despite their intentions to essentially continue to live as possible within these conditions. But the reality is that the US has taken this opportunity to finally push Cuba on the wall to a point of no return in terms of their economic recovery. You have to think about this not just in terms of what Trump announced this week, but what Trump and Biden and what the US has been doing for decades. Everything has led up to this moment. Lester Mallory, decades ago, talked about pushing Cuba to the point where the Cuban people themselves would rise up. And that has never happened. There's never been an uprising of the Cuban people against the revolution. But they have succeeded in definitely deteriorating the conditions of life on the island. And one of the most gruesome aspects of this is that it has forced hundreds of thousands of Cubans to flee the island. Not because they disagree with the political system, not because they weren't able, to live freely under socialism, but because the US has made it impossible for them to have normal economic lives on their own island.
I mean, it really is something. I mean, and it's so twisted. I'm sure you saw Ted Cruz on with, talking about his grandfather or father or whatever being tortured.
Who didn't flee.
Yeah, who didn't flee. He was trying to blame it on Castro, and then he was like, well, actually, wait, it was Batista. And it's just like, these people, it's such an upside down world. And I guess that's my question for you in a way is, what are they so angry about? Because it can't be any of the excuses they give about human rights because, regardless of whatever the truth is about Cuba, you just look around the world. Obviously, you look at who they're giving billions of dollars to. It can't be about that. So what is it that makes them so angry about this small island that has only ever said, hey, United States, close neighbor, let's have really good relations?
Well, how do we know the Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Trump don't care about Cubans and human rights? It's clear when they actually arrest thousands of Cubans in immigration detention centers across the country and abuse their human rights right there, right then and there. It's clear. It's clear they never cared about democracy when you look at what they do to democracy in their own country. So what it really matters about with Cuba is that at the end of the day, Cuba, a country that doesn't have major natural resources, there's no oil for the US to hunt after in Cuba. But the fact that Cuba decided many years ago, on January 1st, 1959, that it would make its own decisions for its own people in its own interest, regardless of what the US thought, was the final blow to that relationship. The US simply cannot understand and refuses to accept that the Cubans have an independent government of theirs, that the US doesn't have any say in how Cubans run their day-to-day affairs. And ultimately, Cuba has paid the price for this independence, for this sovereignty. And while some may say that the Cubans are crazy for doing this, I think they have the admiration of people all over the world. People in countries all over the world wish they had governments that would be willing to stand up for them like the Cuban government does.
So I want to ask you, Manolo, from that, how is Cuba continuing to resist all these renewed sanctions? What forms of resilience or resistance are you seeing? I mean, you visit Cuba pretty, quite often. You see the deterioration, obviously, probably in infrastructure because sanctions blockade prevents the ability to maintain. You see the deterioration in the availability of products, I'm sure. Yet, people continue to power through, and the government does continue to exist despite all that. So, yeah, talk a bit about sort of resistance and perhaps beyond that, how people outside of Cuba can help push back against these sorts of imperialist policies.
Well, I'm always moved by the Cuban people and their approach to crisis, because any other country that would be living under these circumstances of intense sanctions, of a tightened blockade, of essentially a declaration of economic war by the mightiest empire in our history, would either surrender or, basically fall in line with US demands. In fact, we see often how many countries, when they're faced these circumstances, often tend to impose neoliberal reforms. They tend to go the route of privatization. They tend to basically do everything possible to maintain the privileges of a few and ignore the needs of the many. Cuba, under the worst circumstances, with deteriorating infrastructure, with less fuel, with less food, with less medicine, is still managing to fairly distribute its resources to all of its people. I won't deny that these are hard times for the Cuban people, but everywhere I go across the island, I continue to see schools that are being run for children in a classroom of 10 or less. I continue to see workplaces that continue to function despite the lack of resources. I continue to see hospitals and clinics that, despite lack of medicine, continue to receive patients, and doctors that continue to work with their patients. That is the sign of a society that is not just different. I would say it's remarkably different to anywhere else on our planet. A society that has essentially chosen to, despite everything, live for its people. And that's an example that I think for the people of the United States and for the people of the world.
No, I think it's such a critical point. And, you travel around the world and you go to all these countries where they have the big gleaming towers downtown, but you go into the slums and the favelas and certainly the rural areas, and people have access to nothing in terms of the type of social, welfare programs that you're able to access in Cuba, and the development of human capital, which I think is notable. I mean, a pharmaceutical industry that's really second to none around the world, despite all of this. So it really is a notable factor. And the other thing I just wanted to have you speak to, Manolo, is the point you were making about Cuba's vision around the world. We were able to to have a great video from our colleague Luis, who's there in Cuba, about the impact of Vietnam working with the rice industry. He's done other packages. Luis always working very hard for us at Breakthrough News, covering what's happening there. So another reason you should follow Breakthrough News and hit the bell and subscribe and get the alerts. About China and the solar power industry. Of course, we know about the people-to-people work here in the United States, where many tens of thousands of people regularly, provide humanitarian aid. The same is true in Europe. That Cuba is not really isolated in so much as it's being suffocated, but there really are tremendous efforts, it seems, by friends of Cuba to try to step into the breach here, and that feels like an important element of the broader struggle of people around the world against U.S. imperialist policies that are so harmful.
Well, I think it's a two-way street. On one hand, despite all the threats, particularly from Marco Rubio, against Cuba sending its doctors across the world, Cuba continues to have tens of thousands of doctors and teachers and social workers working among the poorest communities on the planet. Anywhere you go on the planet where there's a poor community, there's bound to have been or currently existing a Cuban doctor or a Cuban teacher. That is, I think, a sign of what Cuba's commitment to humanity is. And I think that humanity has responded in return. I think from the example of the Vietnamese farmers who are helping to Cuba grow rice in Cuba, to activists in Europe who, when COVID happened, it was Cuban doctors who were among the first to arrive in Italy to support them face the COVID pandemic. There are Italians now sending medical aid to Cuba. You see this all across the world, and I think it's a sign of actually that there's hope for humanity. There's hope in a humanity in which we actually commit to taking care of each other, despite the threats of the country that insists on being the world's policeman without being elected by anyone.
No, I think that's a very relevant point. I was in Haiti, in 2021. You actually do know that. And the only place you could get a COVID test was staffed by the Cuban medical mission. And I thought that said a lot. I mean, about, many things, but about the role that Cubans are playing really around the world. Well, as always, Manolo, there's a lot to this. We're going to have to keep covering it and keep following it. We'll see what happens at the end of the 30 days, but we really appreciate you joining us here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you, Rania and Eugene.
Mm-hmm. Rania?
Well, Eugene, I mean, everywhere you look, the U.S. demands complete submission. And without complete submission, they will crush you. And that goes from Cuba to Gaza. And we're seeing that right now, by the way, with the ceasefire proposal with Gaza, which I know we wanted to talk a bit about before we close here, Eugene. There's this 60-day ceasefire proposal that Trump is trying to push on behalf of Israel, really, because it's all Israeli language, or what Israel would want. It's not really a permanent cessation of hostilities. It creates a framework for Israel to continue to kind of do what it wants to do, to regroup, to target and hit things when they want to. And every ceasefire we see that Israel is party to anywhere, it's only one side ceasing fire. And that is the non-Israeli side. Well, Israel just keeps bombing and bombing and bombing whenever it feels like it. And it seems that this proposal would allow for more of that. And I will say this comes on top of the fact that the Israelis have killed in the last 48 hours 300 Palestinians. 300 people in 2 days. It's sick. And just not that there's a nice way to kill people, but like in really just horror movie style ways. The images out of Gaza, I mean, what you see on the screen right now, just this constant apocalypse, it doesn't end. And until they get 100% submission, they're not going to stop. And for them, 100% submission is to just take over all of Gaza. So we might see some sort of pause, since Trump is pushing for it, in the coming days or maybe weeks. I know there's a meeting next week between Netanyahu and Trump. But all that said, this is going to be on Israel's terms, because everything in the region right now is on Israel's terms, because it's all reinforced by the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a way it's like Israel's terms are the U.S.'s terms. I mean, we saw this with what was happening in Iran, all of these differences between the U.S. and Israel is just kabuki theater. In fact, behind closed doors, they're coordinating the whole time. I mean, Hegseth said the thing about the bombing. He was like, yeah, it took months for us to set all this up. So obviously, we also know from the Israelis that, they've been working with the White House for months in terms of how they were publicly messaging the issue of differences between Netanyahu and Trump. So the whole thing is all one big stitch up, and it always has been since, you could argue, since 1948, but certainly since 1973, the U.S. and Israel sort of jointly working to assume the same goals. And yeah, it's a total submission point here. I mean, obviously Hamas has really tried to underline the point that they want this to be a permanent end to the conflict, which Israel will not agree to. And, you look at the context of the coalition that Netanyahu has, and you have Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who, of course, want to return settlements to Gaza that were removed in 2005 by Ariel Sharon. I mean, and when you're saying that you're to the right of Ariel Sharon, I mean, the author of the Sabra and Shatila massacres, I mean, one of the worst of the worst, so it just gives you a sense of how out of control these people are. But that being said, so they obviously don't want to end the war. They've said they won't have any, Trump is talking about, oh, well, the Arab countries will take over. Well, I mean, they want, first and foremost, haven't even agreed to that. But, they're saying they want the Palestinian Authority in there. And Israel is saying they'll never accept the Palestinian Authority, so that they'll only accept basically, a total, maybe some of the people will be Palestinians, but some sort of like Palestinian extension of the Israeli security forces, even more so than what the PA has become in the West Bank, which in and of itself is telling you a lot. So they don't want to end this war. They want to reoccupy parts of the Gaza Strip. They want to kill as many people as possible. And I think, we had a thief on this show, the humanitarian aid worker who was in Gaza for a number of weeks. And he made the point that he's like, well, they're saying that they want people to leave, but anyone who applies to leave, they won't let them leave. So, obviously they're trying to just massacre and murder as many people as they possibly can. I mean, yes, I think they hope that they can push out people at a certain point, but I think it's even worse than that. I think that they could have probably pushed out more into Egypt if they wanted to, if they let them leave, if they just bombed, say, part of the fence or something and let people leave. But they've decided to try to kill as many as possible. I mean, it really is unbelievable. 26 separate massacres those 300 people are killed in. We've seen the footage now, and we have it on our social media for Breakthrough News. It's been all over the media. People have probably seen it, of the U.S. mercenaries, killing people, or talking about killing people with live ammunition. It's the Squid Game, type scenario where they're playing this sort of like murderous red light, green light with Palestinians. I mean, you even had the Haaretz report of the soldiers, the Israeli soldiers. And, okay, fine. You might hear someone who's pro-Palestinian say, oh, this is like a Holocaust. These are like the Nazis. And people say, oh, that's too much. Oh, you're saying too much. Well, this soldier who was there told Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, and he is an IDF soldier, he said, I felt like a Nazi when I was in Gaza. Now, that's a pretty powerful thing for somebody to say in any context, I would say. And I think when you look at it like that, it really is something. So anyway, there's a lot that we could say about this, but why don't we just go ahead and close on that note? I think that, we've said this many times, and people can continue to see, what is happening there. And we'll continue to cover it on a number of different fronts here, as it were. Rania, anything you would like to say before we get out of here?
Yeah, I just want to remind people that they need to smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm, you guys. And make sure you hit the subscribe button if you aren't already subscribed to Breakthrough News. Hit the bell. Me and Eugene will have more specific instructions about how to make sure you get notifications after we do our homework.
No, they sent me something. They sent me something. Let me look at it here. I have a photo that I was sent on my phone, as if the team doesn't think that I'm in the show. I just looking at my phone. But anyway, okay. So apparently once you subscribe, it will say that you've subscribed, and then there's a little arrow that's like a drop down menu. Then you need to go down, and it'll say that you can have alerts for all, or you can personalize it, or none. Don't click none. You can personalize it, but maybe you should just hit all. That's maybe the easiest way to do it. But once you hit subscribe, there should be a little down arrow. You should see a bell. You'll see the word subscribed. Then you'll see a down arrow. Hit that down arrow, then select either all or personalized and personalize your alerts. And that allegedly is how you will get the alerts.
I love it. I hope you took copious notes, because that was. We're gonna have to make those instructions easier with like a little graphic or something. Yeah. But you guys, do what Eugene just said. Also, make sure that if you are able, that you're supporting Breakthrough News by going to patreon.com/breakthrough news. We are able to continue to go and grow with support from our audience because we're an independent media outlet. That means that we don't take money from Lockheed Martin, nor do we play advertisements from Boeing, or like various Gulf state airlines, which a lot of the CNN and a lot of the mainstream news channels seem, at least here in Lebanon, when I'm watching CNN, God, I got to stop doing that. But they often play advertisements for all the Gulf state airlines and tell you to go visit. So we don't do that here at Breakthrough News because we're independent and we want to be able to criticize the Gulf states because they're not so great. All that's to say, patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Tomorrow is July 4th. I hope I'm not coming down with something, Eugene. I mean, people can tell my voice is a little bit raspier than usual. But, you know, I'm going to drink some tea to make that better. Now I'm just rambling. I'm a little bit delirious here.
Or something, you know what I mean? I didn't know.
No, I'm so, you know how healthy I am. I don't smoke. If it was like Eugene, you know what my dream is?
Yeah.
Aside from doing the journalism I already do and making Breakthrough News bigger than CNN, my dream is to, in parallel to that, open a gym for leftists and call it Red.
And on that note, we are going to go ahead and close the show here.
The Red Zone.
Oh God. Let's go ahead and end this before we get the third iteration here. Thanks everybody. We are actually going to be taking a couple weeks off because we got to make some moves, but we will be back with you in the latter part of July. So for myself, for Rania, for the whole Breakthrough News team, we will see you next time.